Welcome. It has just gone 7 p.m, Wednesday the 15th of June, and you are watching episode 52 of Regional Wrap. Regional Wrap, providing an insight on the issues affecting regional Australia and giving a voice to regional residents. My name is Bill Bates, and joining me on this episode, Forests, Human Management or Abandonment, is my guest, Roger Underwood. Roger is an experienced forester, writer and historian. Born in Perth and educated at the University of Western Australia, he worked for nearly 50 years in the forest conservation, research and fire management area. He is the founder and chairman of the Bushfire Front, an organisation dedicated to best practice in bushfire management based upon many years of hard-won field experience and on-the-ground fire behaviour research, followed by successful implementation of forest fuel controls. Bushfire Front advocates for better management of fires in WA, especially on forested lands, to reduce the impact and severity of bushfire damage. It has made strenuous efforts to raise the interests of authorities in improvement of bush management and has made numerous submissions to the government and bushfire inquiries, including those of the 2019-2020 summer. Roger has published half a dozen books on forestry and bushfire history, a history of botanical science in Western Australia, and has authored numerous scientific papers and popular articles. He is a prolific contributor to Quadrant Online across numerous topics in addition to forestry and bushfires. Welcome, Roger.
Hello, Bill.
Welcome tonight. I thank you for giving us your time. If you could just start off and give us a bit of a history about yourself from your mischievous childhood, maybe. You weren't happened to be, I mean, I was, unfortunately. I was a bit of pyromaniac as a kid because back in those days, we had incinerators and all those things in our backyard. And we ever had the opportunity to burn rubbish in it and light up fires, and also had many spare blocks around the place that always had to be burned off in the summer period. Some of them was a little bit mischievously lit.
Yes, well, fire played a part in my childhood. I grew up in suburban Perth, and interestingly, when I think back on it, we had a wood fire in the kitchen. We had a wood fire in the lounge room, and we had a wood fire under the copper in the wash house. So I was used to fire from my earliest childhood. And I was also lucky in that my father was an agricultural scientist and a man who understood the bush. He'd grown up on a farm, and he encouraged me as a young man to know and to love and to understand rural Western Australia. I spent most of my high school vacations working on farms around the wheat belt of Western Australia. But I was really lucky because when I finished my high school years, I applied for and was awarded a forestry scholarship. And I didn't know what forestry was, but it sounded interesting. My father was very encouraging. And one of the beauties of this scholarship that I got was that as one of the conditions, we had to work every vacation over the 4 years of our degree course. Every vacation had to be worked in the forest, and under the way they had it organised in those days, I started at the very bottom. I started immediately after I left school at the age of 17 in a fire gang at Dwellingup as radio and billy boy. That was my job. And on the very second day of working in the gang, we went to a bushfire. So that my interest in and my knowledge about fires, firefighting, fire management started on day 2 of my career. Anyway, after I graduated, I became a forester with the West Australian Forest Department. Worked for many years in all over the place in Western Australia. Went away for a couple of years and did some postgraduate work in the USA, and became a district manager, then a regional manager. And 30 years down the track, I ended up in a reasonably senior position, responsible for bushfire management in forests, national parks and nature reserves across the whole of Western Australia. So my career spanned starting at the bottom and finishing pretty much at the top in terms of fire. So I saw it all. And then after I left the department in 1994, I set up a small consultancy business and did fire consultancy work with government agencies, local government, private people, all over Australia, and did some work also in the USA and in Canada. But I also followed my other great interest in retirement from the department, and that was researching and writing about bushfire and forestry history, because it's a field in which almost nothing has been written over the years. So I was pleased to be able to write about what had happened, and often to write about it from the perspective of having been there at the time. I should have mentioned earlier that during the time I was a forestry student, I was actually working as a firefighter, and this was during the time of the great 1961 bushfires in Western Australia, which were a real watershed for bushfire management, because in one summer, 4 towns were burnt, hundreds of thousands of hectares of forest, farmland were burnt, and really quite disastrous outcomes from that summer. And I was there at the time.
But that was a really incredible fire in regards to it was so severe, but we didn't lose a life. Whereas in eastern states, we seem to click over with fires and have multiple fatalities. So is there anything about the dwelling up fires that sort of lent itself for this fairly miraculous situation where there wasn't a life lost, although there was plenty of damage, of course?
Yeah, no, well, 4 towns completely burnt out, but miraculously, wonderful work done in saving lives. And the fires were pretty much confined to the forest zone, where at that time there weren't big towns. The towns that were built were relatively small forestry and timber towns, and the people who lived in them were experienced bush people. They were fire sensible, and they knew, for example, once things got really bad at dwelling up, the town was under threat. People almost didn't need to be told. They knew that the place to go was the football oval, and to shelter in their cars until the fire went through. And it was amazing at the time for people to see how they pretty much, they were experienced bush people and they knew how to look after themselves. Whereas today, the situation would be radically different, because firstly, there are so many more people living in the bush and around and in towns in the forest area. But the majority of these people are ex-townies. They're not people with a long tradition of bushfires. They don't know much about bushfires, and they get themselves into trouble and they don't prepare properly. And I could see that very clearly with the 2019-2020 fires in New South Wales particularly, that whole towns were being evacuated at the last minute in situations where there was no plan. And so that the sort of disasters that happened at that time in those places were pretty inevitable. And to be honest, things aren't all that much better in WA. There's whole communities down in the southwest at the moment where the state of preparedness in terms of surviving a bushfire is very poor. And
I suppose it's really a lot of it's to do with people seeking the tree change, as they call it, and they want to live in the environment rather than be aware of the environment, and that seems to be a very dangerous sort of situation going forward.
There's two sorts of, might be more, but there's two main sorts of people that I deal with. The first are the people who say, it'll never happen to me. These are people who are living in cloud cuckoo land, and they think that bushfires will only happen to other people. There are other people who think that the preparatory work that is needed to harden up a property, to harden up a community, which often involves thinning of forests and fuel reduction, burning, they've been led to believe foolishly that this is bad for the environment, whereas in fact the opposite is true. So that we often come against people who actively resist bushfire preparatory work, bushfire mitigation work, under the mistaken idea that it's going to lead to the loss of biodiversity and the ruining of the environment and so on, whereas the reverse is the case. Where the preparatory work is not done and an enormous summer bushfire rips through, that's when you see the real environmental damage and the real loss of biodiversity. So we're dealing with people who are either they're ignorant or they're stupid, and ignorant, stupid people get into trouble, and that's what happens.
But one of the most concerning thing is the people who are supposed to be in charge seem to be falling more and more under that category themselves, because the first time I noticed a situation where lifelong experience, expertise and practical on the ground work was sort of ignored by bureaucrats and governments was actually in Victoria with a friend of mine whose family history had been in dredging the Goulburn River, basically for gravel for an aggregate plant and batching plant. And that had been going on for decades and decades. And then all of a sudden, some higher force came to a decision that dredging is not good for the rivers, and basically locked people out of doing that. And I don't know, is the same thing now that people of great experience with who had feet on the ground and experience are sort of being overtaken by intellectuals and armchair experts?
Well, the way I look at it is this, Bill, and that is that bushfire people fall into pretty much into two categories. There's the people who are involved in fires as land managers. These are people who are involved with and are responsible for state forests and national parks, and for managing them and for managing the outcomes when it comes to bushfires. And these people generally, in my experience, are in favour of programs that mitigate, prepare and make things better. Now, the other category of person are the emergency responders. These are the people whose interest is in fighting fires after they start, rather than in preventing them from starting in the first place. And it's the emergency responding people who have come to be in the ascendancy in Australia these days. The forestry people and the land management people have bit by bit fallen behind and become less influential in deciding how things are done. And so we've got this situation in Australia at the moment where bushfires are seen as an emergency which you tackle after they start, rather than seeing bushfires as being something that we can predict and take steps to ensure that they don't become an emergency further down the track. It's a sad thing, but I just believe that we've gone 180 degrees in the wrong direction over most of Australia in the last it's happened over the last 20 years, or probably 25 years, that we've seen the emergency responders, the men in the uniforms with the braided caps, are now calling the shots. Not so much in WA. In WA, we reached a watershed about 2015, 2016. We were going straight down that track, and things were getting worse year by year by year. And we'll come back to that in a minute, because that's really was the genesis of our little group called the Bushfire Front. But in 2015, there was a series of really bad fires in Western Australia. A town got burnt, lots of lives were lost, shocking damage. And there was an inquiry, and it was the best inquiry we've ever had. And instead of appointing a lawyer or a general or an academic to do the inquiry, the government made a good step. They actually employed someone to inquire into these fires, who was a bushfire expert. A bloke called Ewan Ferguson came from Victoria, and he did a magnificent job. And he produced a report which was accepted by the government and implemented, and it's led to quite a substantial reorganisation of departments, new appointments and new policies. So we've got a long way to go in WA. We're not perfect by a long shot, but we're on the right path now. But when I look at Victoria, New South Wales, Victoria in particular, I despair. I really do, Bill. I mean, the Victoria, in my opinion, which was once the leading state, one of the leading jurisdictions in the world back in the 70s and 80s in terms of bushfire management, they're now a laughing stock. They're a basket case, and we just despair of the way they're going. And you wrap all that up together with the absurd notion that bushfires are caused by climate change, and then you can see that things are only going to get worse. They're not going to get better.
Well, although there's probably not a lot of detailed history on the actual different bushfires, there is definitely some reasonable records of the occurrences and some events, although it probably lacks in-depth studies of each one of these fires. But we can go back to just after the first settlement. I think in New South Wales, I think by 1790s, they were confronted with really hot weather and fires. But then I think one of the first major fires that was sort of a big impact was probably 1851 in Victoria, and it was more to do with the grass fires. But that just caught everyone in regards to the stock losses and, of course, human lives. But it was, and crops, it was completely devastating, and there was nothing you can do but other than maybe learn a lesson from it going forward. And we've had fires after fires. We had the 39
fires after fires, and it's almost laughable. You know, we've had Black Saturday, Black Friday, Black Wednesday. We just about run out of Ash Wednesday. We're running out of days of the week. But you go back 100 years, and anyone who's prepared to do 5 minutes research can give you a detailed timeline, a chronology of shocking bushfires in Australia. And it's just incredible to me that we've got this history of bushfires, and we have a very good understanding of the climate of Australia and of the vegetation of Australia, and we can see how they all come together. And even despite all of this, we can't get our bushfire management effectively organised. It's quite strange, really, and tragic.
I think one of the other things is too, those bushfires also leave you the opportunity to explore the weather events beforehand, the general conditions over the years surrounding that event. So there's a lot of, besides the fire in itself, there's a lot of other information you can compile and sort of refer to, and then get a picture of, as you're going forward, what's the likely scenarios as these situations arise again, you know, droughts in particular areas, maybe.
Well, drought is a very important thing, and if you go back over the series of bushfires, the really bad bushfires in Australian history, I don't know what the percentage is, but I think it must be very, very high. The bulk of them occur at the end of a prolonged drought. And what happens is you get a few years of well below average rainfall or no rainfall. The bush dries out. And then you get the changes in the weather, and the instability comes at the end of it, the lightning storms, and away you go. And I've seen it happen over and again. It's, you know, Bill, the thing that annoys me most these days is the people that come out every time there's a fire and they say the conditions were unprecedented. What rubbish. We've had conditions like this over and time again. It's not unprecedented. It's normal Australian summer weather. That's what happens. It gets hot and it gets windy, and you get lightning strikes, and you have droughts. You go back for as long as you like.
Cover for bad management.
Well, that's what I believe, that it's, people use the word unprecedented to refer to the conditions as a cop out, because to admit that the conditions were predictable is to admit they hadn't prepared for them. And yeah, it's an escape from accountability, in other words.
Reading the Bushfire Front website, there's obviously a great deal of expertise, both number of individuals and years clocked up in the field. Can you give us a bit of idea, sort of how many submissions you've made, and also not just the interaction with government, but landowners? Because that's one thing in Australia. We have, you know, seriously big landowners who would have land that has a particular problem and potentially to suffer from bushfire. Can you give us some insight in regards to your advocacy and some of the jobs you've undertaken?
The history of the Bushfire Front's an interesting one. I mentioned earlier that I left the department in 1994 and worked for myself and in the consulting practice. And by the year 2003, when the big bushfires occurred, the Canberra bushfires, I could see that we were on exactly the same track in Western Australia. We were going downhill in terms, everything was going wrong in terms of bushfire management. And I made a number of attempts to meet with ministers. I met with the then Premier, but I got absolutely nowhere. Nobody took any notice of me at all. So I thought, what I need is support and numbers. And I accumulated a group of people to join me, and consider some of the, I mean, there was a former Conservator of Forests, there was a former Director General of the Department of Premier and Cabinet, there was a former Chief Commissioner of the Public Service Commission, there was a former General Manager of the Department of Conservation and Land Management, there was George Peat, Australia's premier bushfire scientist at the time, and one or two others. And what brought these people together was that we were all retired foresters. We'd all started at the bottom. We'd all been through the whole business of bushfires, and through also through the development of a successful system that applied in WA during the 70s, 80s and 90s. And so it was a good group, but the funny thing was, still nobody listened to us. We made submissions, we went and saw ministers, we went and saw senior bureaucrats, and we basically got the cold shoulder. And but something happened, and that something that happened was the Black Saturday bushfires in Victoria. And there was a movement from us getting the cold shoulder to us getting the warm shoulder. And what I call the warm shoulder is when everyone agreed with us, but nothing was done. So that we at least had achieved some credibility by that stage. But luckily, when Ewan Ferguson and his inquiry into the 2015-16 fires came in, we were very well positioned. We had all of our stuff at our fingertips, and we were able to put it forward. And so the group's changed quite a lot over the years. I'm one of the few originals that's left, and I'm pretty old and decrepit myself now. But there's a new breed of young people coming in who are bringing new energy and new expertise, and it's pretty good. And we are looked up to by government here as being able to provide an independent voice. The government ministers, they get all their advice from their departments and from their bureaucrats. But the better ministers, the ones that have got something between their ears, they realise that to really understand a problem, you've got to see it from several different directions. And it's not unusual for us these days to be invited by ministers to come in and talk to them about bushfire matters and to give them an independent point of view about what's going on. And it's the same with the senior bureaucrats in the two main agencies. We have a very good relationship with them now, and they don't always do what we think they should do. They've got their own priorities, but they give us a good hearing, and mostly we agree with what they're doing. When I talk to my counterparts in New South Wales and Victoria, to a lesser extent in Queensland and Tasmania, they're very envious of us for this, because people like us who are independent of government and who are not emergency services people don't get a hearing. Nobody takes any notice of them, and that's got to change. I don't know how to change it. I thought that the Black Saturday bushfires would change everything, but they've just seen what's come out of the Black Saturday bushfires in New South Wales, as far as I can see, is things are worse than they were before. All they've done is to create a whole new bureaucracy sitting over the top of the people who are doing the work out in the field, and I can't see any real progress being made. And give us another 10 years, that's about what it takes, another 10 to 12 years, and you can count on it. There'll be another black summer without any doubt whatsoever, unless things change.
In 1983, we had the Ash Wednesdays fires, and I'd just been posted from Perth to Melbourne with the Defence Force to take up a position in Melbourne. And we actually drove in from Ballarat into Melton just ahead of the fires. And I remember all the kerfuffle that was going on with those fires and the reports. And then in the following days, I was in one of the tall buildings in Defence, and we just watched the aftermath of a big windstorm come in from the Mallee and bring all the ash, and it basically blackened out the city for several hours. And then I was also in Melbourne for the Black Saturday, and I actually lived there at the time. And we woke up on Sunday morning, and basically no one there was actually no one knew that in the early hours of Sunday morning that Marysville had actually been completely obliterated and hundreds of lives lost. I mean,
176 people lost, yeah.
I was just amazed, considering their day and age. It was 2003, 2009. Considering our communications and everything else and our reporting and that we on Saturday night we're completely oblivious to what was going on. The chief, the police commissioner, Christine Nixon, when that was going on, was out for dinner, and it was actually a complete debacle. I don't know how heads didn't roll over that whole thing, but you would have think out of that exercise some serious lessons should have been learnt, because from my recollection, the fire started way up near sort of Macedon Way, and triggered across with high winds, because the days before we had high winds, temperatures of 43 degrees, and like no one was prepared for what, the bomb that was coming.
Well, there was a Royal Commission after those fires, and it was a good Royal Commission, and they produced a very good report and good recommendations. Everyone was enthusiastic about them for a while, but you know what? Within about 5 years, the Victorian government was watering them down, and today the recommendations of that Royal Commission have been so severely watered down that they hardly count anymore. And lessons learned, I mean, jeepers creepers. When you think that Victoria was just about burnt out in 1939, then there was the huge fires in 1983, and then the huge fires in 2009, you'd reckon that the penny would have dropped by now, that something needs to be done. But doesn't seem
before the event.
Yeah. Prepare for it. The old saying that they used, when I first started as a forester, I was told by one of my bosses and mentors that old phrase, hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. And that was the motto. I used to have that written on a piece of card in the wall of my office when I was a forester. And preparing for the worst, I saw that as being the most important job that I had as being in charge of a forest area. I wish that everyone thought like that these days.
Before we move on a little bit more about bushfires, I'd just like to talk about forestry in general and the change that's gone on over the years of anti-logging, sort of people retreating, or loggers and people retreating out of the bush management, forestry management area, in regards to being actively engaged in those areas, working the land, taking off timber, having a good overview what's going on a daily basis, sort of thing. Do you think that this move to sort of remove logging from the forest and that has a detrimental effect in regards to the continued acquirement of knowledge, and also keeping abreast of everything that's going on in the forest?
Well, I'm sorry to see it. In fact, I think it's a tragedy that the native forest timber industry had been basically shut down right across Australia for a number of reasons. And that firstly, I thought it was a good industry and it was sustainable. We had good systems of regeneration, which meant that areas that were logged were regenerated, and the regrowth forests that came away in the wake of logging were very beautiful and very productive forests. So and there is no evidence that any species of plant or any species of animal has become extinct as a result of planned and well managed timber operations in our state forests. Furthermore, I love timber, and timber is it's a beautiful product, and it's a commodity that is in demand and is useful. And timber it's recyclable, it's regeneratable, and the community wants to use timber. But from now on, we're going to have to get either inferior timber from plantations, or we're going to have to import it. So I'm sorry to see that, the beautiful timber like from some of our stringy barks and ash trees, and some of our rainforest trees, magnificent timber. It's a tragedy that will no longer be part of the scene in Australia. And then finally, there is the social impact, because timber workers weren't wealthy people, but they were dinkum Australians, and they lived in the bush and they loved the bush. And when the chips were down, when there was a bushfire, you could always rely on the guys from the mill or the guys from the logging unit. They'd be out there giving a hand, and the industry itself provided roads through the forest. It provided a means of thinning regrowth forests, making them easier to protect. And it was a resource of magnificent machinery that could be brought to bear in firefighting operations. All that's going to be disappearing shortly, and what's going to fill that gap? Well, I know what they think is going to fill the gap. The idea is that the timber and forestry workers who are no longer there will be replaced by volunteer firefighters, and the poor old volleys who do a fantastic job are going to be asked to do the impossible, or there's going to be this reliance on water bombers. And we've already seen people come out and say that this is what we need, the answer to a maiden's prayer, when everyone who knows anything about bushfires, everyone who knows anything, knows that the water bomber is not the answer. There is a role for them, but they're not going to do the job that needs to be done, and they're ineffective when it comes to suppressing intense forest fires. We saw that, I mean, in the 2019-2020 fires in New South Wales. If those squadrons of water bombers were as good as everybody said they were, how come the fires were so bad? The reason being that they aren't as good as people say they are, I'm afraid, and they are no replacement. They cannot replace the forestry people who prepare the land in the expectation of a fire, and the timber workers who, with their special gear and their expertise and their bush experience and skills, provide such a wonderful resource for forest firefighting. So, yeah, the loss of the timber industry for completely mythological, ideological reasons. I mean, the idea is that the support for the closure of the timber industry is that it was destroying the forests. Well, if the forests are being destroyed, how come they're still out there? We've had a timber industry in Western Australia since the 1830s, but the Jarrah forest is still there. We've had a timber industry in the Karri forest since the turn of the 19th century, but the Karri forest is still there. And the idea that the timber industry is destroying the forest, as they say, it's a lie. I can't use another word for it.
Well, it's an invention of people sitting in Perth, Brisbane, Sydney, Canberra, major cities who sort of need to foster that idea to keep themselves in a job. But the other thing, just talking about timber, I mean, it's a renewable resource. I mean, and the thing is, for all those climate warriors, it's one of the best methods of sequestering carbon dioxide. And if anyone goes to anywhere in Europe, go to Munich or any of the towns there, London or whatever, you can walk into buildings that are still held up and have beams that have been there for 700 odd years. And so that's how long that carbon's been stored. So it's quite senseless in regards to thinking we can't sustain timber, and especially Australia. We've got something like 134,000 million hectares of forest land. Even if we only, even if we log 1% of it, that's much more than we probably ever have, sort of thing. We've got 100 years to cycle over the whole landscape, and by then I'm sure that what we did 100 years ago is well and truly regrown, and we probably could harvest 2% and would be regenerated in 50 years.
Yeah, well, I visited a forest just east of Perth a week or two ago, which is adjacent to the Mundaring Wheel, which is the water supply reservoir that feeds the Goldfields water supply scheme. Most people have heard of that, the big pipeline to Kalgoorlie. Now, when they first built that water supply scheme in the end of the 19th century, 1890s, 1902, the fuel for the pumps was firewood, and the the Jarrah forests around Mundaring were clear felled to provide firewood for the steam pumps, and over a million tonnes of firewood was taken out of that forest to provide the firewood for the boilers, for the pumps, for the Goldfields water supply. You go up there today, it's a beautiful new forest. And it's not only a beautiful new forest, it's a national park. Someone has said this forest is so beautiful, we're going to make it into a national park. And it's the people of Perth flood up there on the weekends and they ooh and ah, look at this beautiful forest, without realising that 100 and so years ago, it was clear felled. And so the trouble is, Bill, it's all very well for me. I know about the forest, I've lived in it and I've studied it and I worked at it. And when I go out there and I look at an area that's just been logged, I don't see a devastation of stumps and snig tracks and burnt ground. What I see in my mind, in my imagination, is the new forest that's going to come away in the future and to replace the one that's been cut down. And I can do that. I can visualise the new forest because I've seen it and I've got that experience. And I talk to people who live in the suburbs of Perth and university professors who don't have the experience that I've had, and they do not have that imagination. They can't see that forests regrow. They don't appreciate that. It's a concept that is too hard for them somehow or other. And so they think that when a forest has been logged, that's it. It's gone forever. So anyway, one way or another, they've won that argument, the people that believe that, and the timber industry is now almost non-existent. And with
the other thing is too, these forests, it's not only just regenerate the trees, they actually, the life comes back to the area as well. I mean, right, some of the logging might disrupt some of the wildlife and fauna for a while, but it also provides, once the logging in that area finishes, there's new shoots, there's new growth. It actually is an influx again of wildlife and flora.
There's been a lot of research on this. I mean, going back to the 70s when the environmental movement first started being active in this area, a lot of research and surveys were done in the forest, looking at the recovery of forests in the wake of timber cutting, and the results are exactly as you say. Everything returns. There isn't a bird or an insect or a plant or a fungus that you can name that doesn't eventually find its way back into that forest, and they're all there. The only change that he's made is that there are fewer big trees and more younger trees, and the only thing that's going to fix that is time. And time will fix it, because these young trees will grow into big trees. Well, they would do if the bushfire management was done properly.
The other thing is new forests, like they're much more vibrant as well. The tree, especially if you put trees or manage the trees so they're not fighting each other for water resources and that, like you've got them spaced out. I mean, I think some of the big problems in the United States is they left some of the forest, and there's now so many trees per hectare or whatever that it's actually not overly good for the forest. So new forests can be well planned and well managed to bring better life.
The situation in a lot of those forests in Western USA is that they were cut over, they regenerated, but then the management fell away at that point. They didn't do the burning, they didn't do the thinning, and the forest became very dense, and the trees started to die. And when the trees started to die, the wood boring insects came in and started to eat them. And so bit by bit, you develop this very inflammable forest. And when a fire gets in there, it's unstoppable. So, but look, also from the point of view of carbon sequestration, if you're concerned about that, the younger growing forests are actively sequestering carbon much more rapidly than the old forests that are slowly starting to over mature and die away. So yeah, I mean the young I love the young forest. To me, they're full of vitality, they're full of beauty, and they're full of bird song and wildflowers. I love to look at them, and I wonder why other people don't love them as much as I do. Sometimes they do. They don't even recognise it. For instance, there's a famous area down south called the Burana Forest, a karri forest, regarded as a tourism icon, especially before it got recently burnt, but in a bushfire. But a very beautiful forest, and it's all regrowth. It's all young regrowth that's come away after logging. But people don't know that. They look at it and they think, look at this beautiful forest, without knowing that it's actually regrowth forest that's come away in the wake of timber cutting many years ago.
Okay, well, if we can move on now to the 2019-2020 bushfires in the eastern states. I mean, probably helped cost the Prime Minister the election, the fact that he was over in Hawaii or somewhere where it was on. But there's been various submissions, and I'll just refer to one of the submissions, and that was the submission by the Emergency Leaders for Climate Action. Now, I read that in its entirety, but I did get stuck on a couple of the first few pages in regards to, there wasn't much in regards to bushfire fighting or preparation or anything like that, but there was an awful lot of, about 4 or 5 lead-in pages about climate change and how it's exacerbating the problem. And I did a bit more research and I looked at some of the other submissions, especially by individuals, because organisations have got a lot of expertise in, but I'd like to see what the some of the lay people, or supposedly lay people are. But that was also a reoccurring theme in so many of those individual submissions. They started off all about climate change and we've got to do this and that. Nothing about doing something to prevent the fires, but let's do something to protect things. So that was one thing I sort of drew on from those submissions. Can you give us a bit of enlightenment in regards to what your submission sort of looked at and sort of what it provided?
Well, yeah, I despair over that whole climate change causes bushfires things. We did a pretty intensive review of the New South Wales and Victorian fires in 2019 and 2020, and you can put together a very clear picture of what went on. Firstly, there was the drought, which was meant that the bush was as dry as a chip. Secondly, you had very poor degree of preparation, lack of fuel reduction burning. Thirdly, you had very soft communities, very poorly prepared townships and communities. Then you had multiple ignitions, which overwhelmed the firefighters. And finally, you had some pretty amazingly bad strategic decisions being made at the time of the firefighting. So you put together that little cocktail of things, and it's pretty easy to see that you don't need climate change to explain why there was a bushfire disaster. It's very obvious. And the idea that's being promulgated that if we stop emitting CO2, we'll change the climate of Australia and there'll be no more bushfires, which this is the sort of stuff that I see even of as recently as last week or a week or so. The emergency services guys are putting to the new government, to the Albanese government, and they don't realise that they're talking rubbish, because it's not going to work. It's a very flawed position. Firstly, even if we're successful in minimising or reducing CO2 emissions in Australia, that's not going to affect the climate, because the world's climate is bigger than just Australia. As far as I can tell, we could go to zero emissions tomorrow, and it'd make absolutely no difference whatsoever to climate. So the first thing is, it's not going to work. the second thing, I suppose, is that even if it did work, it's not going to start next summer. It's 10 years or 20 years away. And what we need to be doing is dealing with the bushfires that are coming down the driveway tomorrow, not the ones that are going to come down the driveway in 20 years' time. So it's all hopeless stuff, Bill. I mean, to think that we can turn Australia into England with a cool, moist climate and green paddocks all the time, and temperature never getting over 25 degrees. It's a fool's paradise. It won't happen. I don't care how much they say the climate is causing the bushfires. It's simply not true. I mean, we've had bushfires forever in Australia, and it's to say that it's the result of CO2 emissions since World War II is patent nonsense, I'm afraid.
I think one of the other things in their submission was that the panacea of prescribed burning's not really credible anymore because the climate's changed. The window between the end of the one summer season, fire season, and the start of the next, the window's closed so much, and then the actual ability to do prescribed burning is often limited by the fact that it's warmer than usual, and you can't do the pre-burns. So,
well, it's
is that a good enough excuse not to?
No, I mean the opposite is the case. In the last 5 years in Western Australia, we've done more burning every year, year after year, despite all this stuff they're telling us about the fire seasons getting longer. And one of the things that has been helpful is that because rainfall has been down, there is a significant improvement of opportunity for doing prescribed burning during the winter time, and people have been taking advantage of that. But I say to these people who say prescribed burning is a waste of time, I say come over here and have a look, and we'll show you what's being done, and we will also go through with you chapter and verse of the experience we have every summer of where wildfires are controlled and contained because they've run into areas where prescribed burning has been done. There's some magnificent case studies that we can show. So I think that they're going down the wrong path. I'm sorry to be critical of people in the other states, and I don't want to say we're perfect, because we're not perfect. But at least our policy is the correct policy, and I think the policy that says no burning, but we'll tackle fires after they start and put them out, that policy is doomed to failure. It won't work.
I think also in New South Wales, in a lot of those areas, because there's people have gone there for a tree change, a lot of those communities have actually newer members, who come from Sydney or wherever, and they actively oppose prescribed burning. They don't want to see it, and actually actively campaign to prevent it. I think
it's worse than that, actually.
I think prescribed burning has got, in eastern states, it's basically got down below 2%. Do you have some sort of rule of hand that sort of say, well, how much you should try to get done under prescribed burning annually?
Yeah, for most of the forest areas that I'm talking about the what we call the dry sclerophyll, the stringy bark forests, 12% per year, which gives you a return cycle of 1 year in 8, is the most perfect cycle you can come up with. Nobody gets 12. We used to get 12% back in the 70s in WA, but these days it's more like 8%. And I don't think 8% is enough, but that's what you can work on, and it's certainly better than the 1 or 2% that I see in places in Victoria and New South Wales. And
I can just imagine now people listening to this who come from that sort of forest love type sort of thing, and hearing 12% be sort of panicking, like, you can't burn 12% of the forest. Look, all those little animals and lizards and koalas, you can't do that.
Well, we did it. We did it for 30. We did it for 30 years, and not one lizard, not one kangaroo species, not one plant species disappeared under that regime. Of course, you've got to remember that everything points to the fact that the Aborigines, the Noongar people here, burnt far more frequently than that. And their elders tell us that they used to burn the forest every 3 to 4 years. And I've seen plenty of evidence that our Australian forests are far tougher than people give them credit for. And they're used to fire. I mean, the Australian forests have developed in an environment in which fire has occurred forever. Either it's been lit by people or it's been lit by lightning. It's not fire, isn't it?
Isn't this? Yeah. But isn't there some species of trees that need fire to regenerate as well?
Well, there's a whole heap of species of plant that where the seed won't germinate unless it's been tickled up by a bit of bushfire smoke, and the bushfire smoke is what's needed to get the seed to germinate. And there are other species where that don't flower until they've been burnt. So yeah, fire's a natural part of the environment. And look, you mentioned that the tree change people, but there's a more sinister element than that, and the more sinister element is the anti-burning fraternity in our universities, in academia, and they are spreading a very dangerous message about fire, and it's not just wrong. It's actually dangerous that these people in the universities are saying, don't burn, don't fight fire with fire. But at the same time, they themselves don't have any accountability for the outcomes. It's other people who have to fight the fires that will result, or who will suffer the damage from the fires when they occur. So I regard the influence of the anti-burners in Australian universities as quite sinister, really. I don't know what they're up to. They're going out of their way to put people's lives and to put our beautiful forests at risk.
I think they're also behind the idea of lock up and leave it strategies in regards to public land. And even we've now got NGOs that go and buy land. We've got cases here up on the Cape York where environmental sort of groups have bought up land, locked it and leaved it. But I mean, that's, as far as I'm concerned, if you own land, you should be managing it, and you should also be getting a dividend off it. But locking up, leaving it to exotic weeds, exotic or feral wildlife is no answer. And I think also, especially down in sort of New South Wales and that, if you're going to have a lock up and leave it and keep people out, even recreational users and stuff like that, and you just got to leave it, I think you're going to have things again in regards to the 2019 fires, is the loss of wildlife in those big blazes that you're saving up really all this fuel for to ignite at one big time somewhere in the future.
Yeah, no, the lock up and leave approach is doomed to failure, because bushfires will always start. We can't prevent bushfires from starting. There'll either be a lightning strike, or there'll be an accident, or there'll be an arsonist. And nobody's ever succeeded in getting rid of arson as a cause of bushfires. And I don't think they ever will. So
I don't know. I think my uncle did a pretty good job with me. I was a bit of pyromaniac and lit up a block, and as a young boy, and he remedied that. He put me hand in the fire. and I never
Well,
did it again.
That was the lucky thing was that he could catch you. Most arsonists are never caught.
Yeah, well,
so
I'll tell you what, after having your hand put in the fire, you bloody don't want to ever experience that again. And
no,
I mean, it might have been, he might have been charged with child abuse, these days, but gee whiz, I think it well and truly cured a 10-year-old boy from bloody experimenting anymore and with the pyromaniac sort of side of things. But if I could just move on now before we wrap up, I really want to talk about the 6-point plan that Greg Mellon's produced and presented to the now Minister of Environment and Energy, Chris Bowen. So if I just chuck up a slide of that engagement, and then a quick slide of their 6-point plan, and if we can just refer to a couple of things as just to finish up on. I'll just share the screen now. This is the meeting. I think it was Friday, about a week ago, when Greg Mullins presented his 6-point plan. And basically, it completely centres on reduce greenhouse gases, 75% by 2030, which, like you say, Australia doing that's not going to do anything. I mean, the carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere is now about 420 parts per million. Nothing's going to change that from going up in any time soon in the next 15, 20 years with China and India. So we can reduce greenhouse gases here, but the actual overall parts per million is going to continue to rise. But the other thing is the thing about we need more aircraft and all these sort of things. Do you think, I mean, I don't know if you actually read their strategy, but to me, out of the 2019 fires in New South Wales, the first thing that they did is invent a new department of resilience, Office of Resilience. So now they've got this overarching bureaucracy where someone's on $500,000-600,000 a year, and then you've got all these other bureaucrats, and they're basically overarching the SES, the fire services, and that. It doesn't bring anything more to the ground, but it's going to cost the taxpayer a fair bit. And then when you read this submission, it's got nothing to do with fire mitigation. It's just simply ability to fight the fire after the event. And to me,
they're completely on the wrong track, Bill. Firstly, they think that we can change the climate, which I don't think we can do. And even if we can do it, we're not going to be able to do it quickly enough to sort things out. So they're on the wrong track there. Secondly, they think that if we put enough money into equipment so that we can control fires after they start, there will be no fire. But they're on the wrong track there too, because that approach has never succeeded anywhere in the world, even in the USA, where they can produce. They've got a far greater capability than will ever have here. If Mr. Bowen and the government go down the track of adopting the recommendations of this group, the situation in Australia will only go backwards. It will go backwards, and we will see bushfire after bushfire after bushfire, and all the things that go with it. So it's just, it will be a tragedy if they get up and they get listened to.
I think the other thing is too, it just is the same sort of category of thing in regards to empire building of bureaucrats, in regards to let's have more of these things and more toys and stuff like that. But they forget about what their core job is. And I suppose it was best explained to me by probably someone you know, but I won't mention their name. But they basically suggested conversations with people like who are in that sort of emergency fires service areas, Their attitude is they don't want to be seen as the people who light fires and burn wildlife at described burning. They want to be seen as the heroes putting out the fire.
Yeah,
Now,
well, they do. It's everyone wants to be a hero and have the be able to stand up in front of the television and be receive the plaudits of the community and the media. And it's a very sad thing that the people who do the bushfire mitigation work, the people who prevent bushfires, are not seen as heroes. They never get any acknowledgement at all. Preventing a disaster is not newsworthy. Only the disaster is newsworthy. So it's very difficult for us, people like myself, who are how I regard is we're coming in at the front end of the bushfire situation. Our job, as we see it, is to prevent bushfire damage, whereas these other people are coming in at the back end. Their job, as they see it, is to fight fires, to be the heroes that do the work. Well, you always need firefighters. You can't get away with that. But if we were to do the preparatory work, the mitigation work properly, the need for firefighters would decline, and the need for all these bureaucracies that you're talking about would also decline. So it's a vicious cycle.
I think one of the other things is, like you say, these people also won't be heroes unless they're mega fires. So if all the mitigations put in place, they won't. Even their job could actually become fairly mundane, because the fires that do occur will be of a much minor nature, much more manageable, and probably won't get the swan song.
Easier. The expression I use, that if we do our preparatory work and our mitigation work properly, bushfires will still occur, but they will be easier, safer and cheaper to control. And easier, safer and cheaper are the three things that drive me, because we haven't even talked about the economics of bushfire management in this discussion yet. But those big mega fires, they cost millions and millions and millions of dollars. Whereas the system that I'm proposing, it's by contrast, it can succeed on the smell of an oily rag. The investment in prescribed burning is minuscule compared to the investment in fighting megafires. But we've run out of time, I suppose. We haven't got time to go into the whole economic side of it, but that's something that's worth thinking about.
I suppose I am looking a little bit at the economic size when they're talking about, fleets of fire bombers and that, that scares the pants off me in regards to the cost. And I mean, they sit there, they'll be sitting there idle for a fair bit of time. That's one thing. Yeah, the other thing is, I don't think they're really appreciative of having less fires. It's something that I think they're more pyromaniacs than I am. They want want the fires. They need the fire to justify themselves.
Yeah, no, there's an unholy alliance between the media and the fire chiefs. Both of them love fires. The media love the drama of a fire, especially the television media, with the houses burning down and water bombers swooping, fires coming out of the tops of the trees. It's dramatic, and they love it. And of course, the emergency chiefs love fires because they're suddenly on the front page of the paper and on the TV news being heroes. So that there is this alliance between journalists and fire chiefs, which almost makes a big fire welcome. They can't wait for it. And that's a sorry situation.
Okay, look, we've gone over the hour. I'd like to sort of wrap it up now and let you get on with your tea time and that. But I'll come back to you probably again in a few months' time and maybe with people like, I don't know if you know him, Vic Jurgen,
I know Vic, yep.
And sort of and intermingle the conversation between the environmental part of forestry and the fire management, and also the way to going forward as a benefit to the nation, to actually derive a dividend from our forests rather than just put it on the black box, and the next time we take any notice, it's when the next mega fire is on. Because I find it quite depressing that we do have this group of people and politicians that are happy to lock up land and not allow us to get a dividend from it.
As a society, we're going backwards as a society when it comes to land management.
Yeah, and the other thing is also there's vested interest is actually keeping humans out of the landscape. I mean, there's more and more areas that they're trying to put off limits for recreation and access and things like that. So it's not just fire, it's not just forestry. It's actually it's also just access to the bush that, you know, we should be entitled to use and enjoy, and also harvest the dividend from.
Very good. Thanks, Bill.
Okay, I'll wrap it up now. I thank you very much for your time. I'll just introduce next week's episode, and if you could just stay on the line for a few minutes. If you enjoyed tonight's episode, please like, share, and subscribe to our Facebook pages, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Next week, I will have Ian Heskey on from the National Seniors, and we'll be talking about the opportunities going forward for seniors to be involved more in the economics of Australia going forward and deriving income rather than being in a position where they're not encouraged to actually earn another dollar or participate in the employment force anymore. So please join me again then. Thank you.